Hello, everybody. Here we are going back into the era of Rome. We talked last week about the Roman Republic, and we're going to be moving into the transitional point from the Republic into an empire. And frankly, to make it simple, a republic can only be so big because there's so many decisions that have to be made, large armies to control, um, a a lot of trading networks to be in charge of, and a republic where you have this kind of Senate that argues with itself over the course of months and doesn't really come up with a solid decision in a rapid timeline, sometimes can be a problem. The the Roman Republic had become huge by the time we get to Caesar, and it had become also rather bogged down and corrupt. And so there was a point where either there needed to be kind of a revolution of sorts, a renewal, a change, or there needed to be a different kind of management system. And having a year-long consul just didn't work anymore. So it seemed kind of natural for the Roman Republic to switch over to an empire, and I'm not arguing that anybody should ever do that in any future or current republic. I'm saying that for Rome, it seems to be the way that things were destined to go for a positive outcome. So there you go. A little bit about Julius Caesar, because he's the guy that basically creates the transition. He's not the first true emperor. He's the one that paves the way for the first true emperor. What is it about Caesar? Well, basically, we know a lot about this guy. It does not hurt that there's a lot of records about him, but it also really doesn't hurt that Julius Caesar has his own book that he himself wrote regarding his conquests in Gaul. If you're into the Romans at all or want to learn about this transitional era in Roman history, maybe you're fascinated in reading about powerful people and what they thought about things, Julius Caesar is really the guy to read, along with a few other emperors, of course, you could read as well. But with this guy, he was actually born to a decent family, but they didn't have a ton of money. And so Julius Caesar was going to have to fight his way up the ranks without his parents paying his way. And so what ends up happening is Caesar is going to be involved as a soldier for a few years because there's nowhere else for him to go. He's an officer. And then he is going to be kidnapped by pirates. That's not in the slide, but you can read about it in his own book. But he's kidnapped by pirates, and he convinces the pirates to let him go so that he can go raise a ransom and bring it back. And the pirates let him go, and he goes and raises an army instead, comes back and kills all the pirates. He's just one of those guys, right? Just a fascinating character. Anyway, Caesar is going to go up the ranks. By the time he's 30 years old, which is pretty young for this, he's a senator. Which he couldn't have done this unless he was born to a patrician family. So that's, he's his family background is what gives him the ability to move as rapidly up as he can, as well as his ambition, of course. Age 34, he's put in charge of becoming popular. And what I mean is he's in charge of entertaining the public. And so he spent a lot of money, some of it his own, so that he could put on great big shows of entertainment for the public. And that means his name was everywhere, everywhere. And that makes him quite famous and popular with the people. At age 36, so just a couple years later, he becomes Pontifex Maximus, which is a type of management position over the forum. And the forum is, of course, where a lot of the major entertainments took place. So he's now kind of like a lifelong manager or board member of the entertainments of Rome. At age 39, becomes a governor in Spain. And in this province of Spain, Caesar is able to really show that he can manage an entire part of the Roman Republic. Before he's even 40 years old, he is already in charge of a massive province, maintaining that sphere of influence. So at age 41, he is elected consul. A consul, as you remember, is basically a dictator that serves for a year. The job of a consul is usually to manage a large army and to go wherever that army is sent by the Senate. So, as it turns out, when we get to this point of time, when Caesar is given command of an actual legion, he is going to already be very popular amongst the Romans, which means his soldiers are Romans and they see him as being very popular. And then there are two other consuls. At this point in time, there are three total consuls. The other consuls are Marcus Licinius Crassus. We usually just call him Crassus, who is the richest man in Rome and also in charge of an army, an entire Roman legion. We have Pompeius Magnus. We usually just call him Pompey, and he is a very successful general of the Caesar era. And then, of course, Caesar, who just became a consul, but Caesar's super popular with the people thanks to all the entertainments that he's provided and a lot of self promotion. And so we call this a triumvirate because these are three people who are basically in charge of Rome's military. And if you are in charge of Rome's military, you are in charge of Rome. Now, the reason why all the militaries are not under one guy is because that can turn someone into a dictator too quickly. But you put it under three very powerful people, and if these people get together, they can really create what you might call an oligarchy. You can actually see them create a type of management of the Roman Republic, which the Romans were a bit nervous about. But as it turns out, all three of these guys did not like each other that much. They would make agreements to get what they wanted to get out of being in charge of an entire army, the political and economic resources that come to play there. But they didn't like each other enough to actually become like to overtake the empire and make it their own, that sort of thing. So, how does Caesar get even more popular? He is going to be put in charge after becoming a governor in Spain. So you see Spain here. He then becomes the guy in charge of Gaul. Gaul was a difficult area. This is where France is today. Gaul is a difficult region because it had not been fully conquered yet. And it had a lot of tribal groups in here who were still fighting against the Roman power. What that meant was that if Caesar was going to be put in charge of Gaul as a governor, he was going to be put in charge of the army that had to conquer the remainder of Gaul against the tribal peoples who were still fighting against conquest. So that's what Caesar's going to go to. He now has been in charge of an army for a while, only in Spain, though, which is not a big deal. He's going to have governed. He's going to be popular and everybody knows his name. So now he is going to be in charge of an invasion army that's supposed to pacify all of Gaul and these huge forests of Gaul. And that's what he's going to do. So he becomes the governor of Gaul, and he's going to manage to capture one of the most powerful Gallic leaders and send that person back to Rome to basically be imprisoned and executed there ultimately. And one of the things that Caesar does that I think is fascinating is that this is when he begins writing his commentaries. Basically, as the leader of the Gallic legions, Caesar is going to not just pacify Gaul, which is something that the other leaders of the Roman army could not do yet, but he is going to cross the channel and he's going to invade Britain. And that's something that the Romans had not really done yet. They had not invaded Britain to expand the empire that direction. And Britain, the Romans were familiar with Britain because that's where they did a lot of their tin trading. They would actually bring ships over to Britain just like the ancient Phoenicians did, and they would trade for tin. And again, just like you already know from previous lectures, you need tin to make bronze, and the Romans definitely need a lot of bronze. So there you go. The deal, though, is that Caesar decides that he's going to write a book about his pacification of Gaul. Obviously, this book puts him into heroic light to the people in Rome, and that's what he intends to do with that book. He sends basically chapters at a time into Rome so people know what he's doing. And then, without permission from the Senate, he crosses the channel. There's a whole big story as to how this happens that is really quite fascinating. But he crosses the channel and invades Britain. And when he does this, he's going to become even more of a celebrity to the Roman people because he has now done something that no other Roman emperor has done. He's taken an army, crossed the English Channel, and invaded the island of Britain. That's very new. But without this PR campaign that's going on at the same time, this you can buy from Penguin Books. I think it's probably published by others. It's an interesting read. I recommend it again if you're into this. It's just called The Commentaries, and you can buy this pretty much anywhere. Still around, still interesting. So, what happens to the triumvirate, to the three most powerful leaders of Roman armies? Well, Crassus is going to die over in the east, in Parthia, which is basically near Macedonia. The Senate is going to then be stuck because they've got two great leaders. They've got Pompey, the leader of a Roman legion, and they've got Caesar, the leader of a Roman legion. Both are famous, and Caesar's becoming more famous pretty quickly. And what ends up happening is that the Senate does its best to put the two at odds with each other because it would be too easy for Pompey and Caesar to come together, combine their legions together, and for them to then basically take over control of Rome. So, these guys, this is an era of time, folks, where Pompey and Caesar and the late Crassus, these guys are ruling at a time, or not ruling, they're commanding armies at a time when the soldiers and the people have more respect for the leaders of the military than they do for the government. And that means that the government's always afraid of the ruler, yeah, of the ruling class taking over the government by being popular military generals. So the Senate is always conniving and always trying to make sure that the generals do not get to be too unopposed and too powerful. And Pompey and Caesar both are so popular that they're both a danger to the Senate. So, 8 years in Gaul and a little bit of an invasion in Britain, Caesar is told by the Senate. This 8 years in command of this legion in Gaul that's quite successful. Caesar is told by the Senate, who is kind of afraid of him, that he needs to come home, basically surrender his armies, and he needs to stand trial for having done too much. He's invaded Britain and was not given permission to do that. He has taken over this legion and has commanded it for longer than he was allowed to. And that starting to turn Caesar into a little bit of a dictator, more so than what the Roman government wanted him to be, and they were scared of him. So when Caesar is given this order to disband his legions and go home to stand trial, basically a military tribunal, what he does is he takes his legions and he crosses the Rubicon, meaning heading from Germany into Rome again, crosses with his legion into Italy. And you were not supposed to bring Roman legions into Italy because that was a sign that you were possibly going to take over the country. And so it was outlawed to bring actual Roman legions, except for the home garrisons. You were not supposed to bring, Caesar's army or Pompey's army or Crassus's army. They were in charge of defending the empire, or the republic, I'm sorry, on the outskirts. They were not supposed to be marching into Rome itself because, these are battle hardened armies that could easily take over the Roman Republic and turn it into an empire. And so these guys are scared of this. And so Alia Iacta Est, the die is cast, Caesar crosses the Rubicon into Italy with his army, completely against the rules and against tradition. The question is will the people rebel when Caesar does this? A decade before, 2 decades before, 100 years before? Absolutely. A general would have never considered doing this. But Caesar, not only does he have a giant ego, he, as I mentioned before, is in charge of a very successful, very well-trained army that loves him at a time when people basically saw the Senate as being kind of a failure, being kind of a corrupt, unimportant, impotent failure. So Caesar coming into Italy is it's almost heralded as a delightful thing by the people in Rome who are hoping that he might fix things, if that makes any sense. So when he gets in, he basically takes over as a lifelong dictator. Okay. The Senate, of course, is just terrified of him, but he takes over control of Italy directly over the rule of the Senate. And this is a terrifying thing, of course, but he doesn't. And the people kind of like him there, the public, likes him there because he's getting things done that the Senate has been unable to get done for a long time. So Caesar does a few things that actually grows and stabilizes the empire. That is now starting to happen during his time. Caesar begins to extend Roman citizenship to people that have been conquered, and this means that people who were not from Italy before, from the Latin tribes, can now become full citizens, even if they are from outside of Italy. And that is a big deal. Becoming a citizen of the Roman Republic slash Empire, as it's about to become, is a big deal because that gives you a lot of legal status. It allows you to own land. It allows you to be part of the Roman government. And so this is what's happening now is that Caesar says, you know what, let's just extend citizenship. And that's going to create a lot more peace throughout this entire Roman territory. And that is probably the biggest change that he makes. All right, so there's going to be a civil war, as you might imagine. Pompey and a bunch of senators are going to gather together to try to depose Caesar, to kick Caesar out of Italy because he's taken over. They want to probably execute the guy if possible. So Pompey, the only opposing popular general with his legions and a bunch of senators, flee to Greece and they get their army ready. Caesar is going to take over all of Italy, the city of Rome, and Spain, and he's going to rule that like he's an emperor. He's not. He's got a smaller army than Pompey does and the senators do, but he is going to defeat them. So Caesar is going to go to Greece and he's going to fight Pompey and the senators. He's going to win. Pompey will flee to Egypt to try to escape from any kind of retribution. And that is where Pompey will die, by the way. Pompey is actually going to be captured by the Egyptian government, and he's going to be given to Caesar. And Caesar will, at that point, basically take over Egypt as well. Caesar's the first guy in Roman history to put himself onto coins. That's a very, self-aggrandizing thing to do. It's basically saying that he is an emperor now. So he's a self-styled emperor. And this is something that any normal person would never do in the Roman Republic because it was too much like that. The Roman Republic was always afraid of having a king take over or an emperor take over, and so they only allowed gods to be put on coins, not people that were actual real people. So that's what's going on here. Caesar is making sure that he is the one that everybody sees. So what happens now? He appoints himself dictator for life, basically consul for life. Caesar rules alone. He's using friends, freedmen, and slaves to govern. Basically, he creates his own government and takes over, and it makes Caesar a type of king. Remember, there is no empire yet, and there is no office of the emperor, which is why we don't really call him an emperor, even though he kind of is acting like one. So we just call him a dictator, which is what he called himself. He starts dressing like an emperor might, though. He's wearing an all-purple toga, the clothing of a king, and he is basically calling himself also a god at the same time. This man had absolutely no problem calling himself a god and calling himself a dictator. And in general, the people of Rome kind of found him to be delightful compared to how bad the Senate had been doing. But of course, the patrician class was terrified of him because he was outruling them. He has taken over, and they were afraid for what that meant for the history of the Republic. A little bit about Cleopatra. Caesar will invade Egypt when he's chasing Pompey, who flees there after Caesar defeats Pompey's army. And he's going to allow Cleopatra to rule alongside Caesar in Egypt. But basically, she's part of the ruling family of Egypt, and Caesar is going to grant her the right to rule in what he's about to call his empire. And so she's going to be his mistress as well as a ruler of Egypt. So the Ides of March, a group of 50 senators are going to invite Caesar to the Senate and they tell him that they're there to have a meeting with him and that they're going to basically hand over more power to Caesar. And so Caesar shows up. And you see, this is an interesting moment because Caesar does not seem to think that anybody would ever betray him at this point, and he kind of thinks of himself as a god now. So who's going to hurt Caesar, you know? And Caesar shows up to the Senate, and the senators decide to murder him. And they pull out their knives on March 15th of 44 BC, and they kill Caesar. And they expect to be heralded as heroes for getting rid of a dictator that tried to take over the republic. Well, a civil war breaks out after Caesar dies, because of course people are going to try to figure out who's in charge now. And Mark Antony and Octavian, who are big supporters of Caesar, Octavian is Caesar's son. Mark Antony and Octavian are going to fight with their army against the armies of Brutus and Cassius and the rest of the senators. And the end result is that Antony and Octavian win, the Senate loses, and now we have the first real emperor that is approved by the new Senate, which is Octavian. So Octavian is going to name himself Augustus, and Augustus, again, his real name is Octavian, is going to be the first real emperor of Rome. And that's how the Roman Republic moves into becoming an empire.